In a quiet Clearwater neighborhood, three teenagers were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. What started as a late-night prank for social media fame took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the consequences of vandalizing. The wrong car. Marcus Chen wasn't your typical high school troublemaker. For 17 years, he had spent his life trying to find his place in a world where his immigrant parents worked double shifts, known for his academic potential that had recently begun slipping away. When they encountered Harold Dutch Kowalski's pristine 1967 Mustang gleaming under streetlight, they had no idea they were walking into a life-changing confrontation. Marcus raised his spray paint can in reckless stupidity that would lead to unprecedented consequences. What began as mindless vandalism would become a month-long journey of redemption. The small Florida community would never be the same after. Three lost teenagers discovered that honor and second chances could forge unbreakable bonds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid Florida air clung to Marcus Chen's skin like a guilty secret as he adjusted his phone's camera angle, the streetlight casting harsh shadows across his face. The livestream counter showed 37 viewers. Not enough. Never enough. His followers expected content, and Marcus had learned that ordinary wasn't viral. "What's up, everybody?" he whispered into the phone, his voice carrying false confidence that had become second nature. "About to show you something epic. Something the suburban squares will never forget." Behind him, Sofia Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, her artistic eye already cataloguing the vintage Mustang parked innocuously beneath the ancient oak tree. The 1967 fastback gleamed under the streetlight, its restoration obvious even in the dim lighting, cherry red paint, chrome bumpers that reflected the moon, someone's pride and joy. "Marcus, maybe we should," she started, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't go soft on me now, Soph. You're the one with the skills. Make it count." Tyler Williams stood at the corner of Maple Street, his lanky frame tense with anxiety. His role was simple: watch for cops, watch for homeowners, watch for trouble. But his conscience was screaming louder than his loyalty, an internal war that left him paralyzed between action and inaction. The neighborhood slept around them, peaceful suburban homes with their manicured lawns and quiet secrets. Clearwater's east side, where retirees settled and families planted roots. Not the kind of place that expected midnight vandalism from bored teenagers with smartphones and spray paint. Marcus's viewer count climbed to 52 as he approached the Mustang. "Check this out, guys. Some old boomer's midlife crisis, just sitting here begging for some artistic improvement." He pulled the first can from his backpack, electric blue, stolen from his father's garage. The metal ball inside rattled as he shook it, the sound cutting through the night air like a warning bell nobody heard. Sophia's hands trembled as she uncapped her own can, hot pink that seemed to glow in the streetlight. She'd been painting murals since she was 12, her talent obvious to anyone with eyes. But this wasn't art. This was destruction, masquerading as rebellion, and every instinct she'd inherited from her military family screamed against it. "Dad would kill me," she muttered, thinking of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez somewhere in Afghanistan, serving his third deployment, while his daughter prepared to disgrace everything he stood for. "Your dad isn't here," Marcus replied, not understanding the weight of that absence in Sophia's life. "Nobody's here. That's the point." The first spray of paint hit the Mustang's hood like a slap, electric blue cursive spelling out words that would have made their grandmothers weep. Marcus held the phone steady, documenting every moment of destruction for his growing audience. 73 viewers now, comments flowing past too fast to read, hearts and fire emojis, and encouragement from strangers who didn't have to live with the consequences. Sophia found herself painting despite her reservations, muscle memory taking over. Her can hissed as she created elaborate tags across the driver's side door, her artistic training evident even in this context. The irony wasn't lost on her, using her greatest gift for her worst impulse. Tyler's voice cracked as he called out, "Someone's porch light just came on." Marcus barely paused. "Which house?" "2 doors down, blue shutters. They're not coming out. Keep going." The vandalism escalated beyond simple graffiti. Tyler watched in horror as Marcus produced a pocket knife, approaching the tires with methodical determination. The hiss of escaping air seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet neighborhood. "Dude, that's not just paint anymore," Tyler stammered into his phone, which he'd forgotten he was holding. "That's like real damage." "That's the point," Marcus repeated, his voice harder now. "Go big or go home, right? This is what gets attention. This is what gets remembered." But Sophia had stopped painting. The weight of what they were doing had finally broken through her peer pressure haze. She stared at her handiwork, elaborate, beautiful, terrible, and felt something die inside her chest. "My dad served with guys who never came home," she whispered, not loud enough for Marcus's live stream to catch. "They died protecting people like us, and this is what we do with that freedom." Marcus was working on the 4th tire when the magnitude of their actions finally hit him too, but he was too deep now, too committed to the performance. 91 viewers watched him slash rubber and smash a taillight with a rock, their comments, feeding his need for validation even as his stomach churned with growing dread. 20 minutes later, they fled into the night, leaving behind destruction that went far beyond teenage mischief. The Mustang sat wounded under the streetlight, its perfect restoration ruined by spray paint and slashed tires, its rear window spiderwebbed with cracks. Harold Dutch Kowalski discovered the damage at 6:30 hours, his military-trained body still waking at reveille, despite 43 years of civilian life. He'd stepped onto his front porch for the morning paper, a ritual unchanged since his wife's death 5 years ago, when he saw his beloved Mustang. For a moment, his 88-year-old mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The car had been perfect when he'd parked it the evening before, gleaming from his weekly wash, and wax. Now it looked like a war zone. Dutch's hands shook as he approached the vehicle, not from age, but from a rage that went deeper than property damage. This car had been his project with Eleanor, their shared obsession during her final years. Every piece they'd restored together, every Sunday afternoon they'd spent in the garage, talking about the past and pretending they had an unlimited future. The spray paint covered Eleanor's favorite color, the exact shade of red she'd worn to their first dance in 1955. The slashed tires had been special orders, the same white wall pattern as the original. The broken taillight had taken him 3 months to find, scouring classic car shows and online auctions. But it was more than the car. It was what the car represented. Respect, history, the idea that some things were sacred. Dutch had served in Korea when he was barely older than the vandals who'd done this. He'd seen boys die for principles these kids couldn't even comprehend. Dorothy Williams watched from her kitchen window as Dutch stood motionless beside his ruined car. At 72, she'd known Dutch long enough to recognize the signs of his increasing confusion, the way he sometimes seemed lost in time. But this morning, his distress was different, sharper, more present. She'd raised Tyler since the car accident that took his parents, and she knew the look of someone trying to process the unthinkable. Dutch wore that expression now, standing in his driveway, in his bathrobe and slippers, staring at vandalism that might as well have been a personal attack. Dutch's military bearing straightened as clarity returned. This wasn't random. This was a message, a statement about the value of things that mattered to old men like him. The vandals hadn't just damaged his car, they damaged his memories, his connection to Eleanor, his faith in the decency of the community he'd called home for decades. He walked back into his house with purpose, his steps steady despite his age. In the hallway, beneath a photograph of his SEAL training class from 1960, sat a small address book filled with names he hadn't called in years. But some numbers, once memorized, never left a military man's mind. Dutch dialed from memory, his arthritic fingers finding the keys by instinct. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Chief Morrison." "Jake, it's Dutch Kowalski. I need to call in a favor." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took for Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison to process that his old instructor, the man who'd saved his life and shaped his career, was asking for help after 15 years of proud independence. "What do you need, Chief?" Dutch looked out his window at the ruined Mustang, at the neighborhood where he'd lived quietly for decades, at the peaceful suburban street where children had apparently forgotten what respect meant. "I need to teach some kids a lesson about consequences." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took for Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison to process that his old instructor, the man who'd saved his life and shaped his career, was asking for help after 15 years of proud independence. "What do you need, Chief?" Jake Morrison was already reaching for his uniform blouse before Dutch finished explaining the situation. 28 minutes later, he stood in the parking lot of Clearwater's Naval Reserve Center, watching his team assemble with the precision that had kept them alive through 3 deployments. "Vandalism!" Petty Officer First Class David Tank Johnson's voice carried disbelief and disgust in equal measure. "Someone hit Dutch's car?" Jake nodded, his jaw tight with controlled anger. Dutch Kowalski had been more than an instructor. He'd been the standard by which Jake measured every decision, every action, every moment of moral choice throughout his career. The man who'd pulled him aside after Hell Week and said, "Leadership isn't about being the toughest or the smartest. It's about knowing when to show mercy and when to demand justice." 3 teenagers, Jake continued, his voice carrying the calm authority that had seen him through Kandahar and back. Live-streamed the whole thing. Spray paint, slashed tires, broken windows. Dutch wants us to pay them a visit. Petty Officer Maria Santos shifted her medical bag to her other shoulder, her dark eyes thoughtful. At 29, she'd seen enough of the world to know that good kids could make terrible choices, especially when they felt invisible or unheard. "What kind of visit?" she asked carefully. "Because if we're talking about scaring some teenagers, straight, that's one thing, but if we're talking about something else..." "We're talking about education," Jake replied, though his tone suggested the education might be more intense than what these kids were used to. "Dutch served in Korea. Trained half the SEALs in the teams over 20 years. He's earned better than this." Tank Johnson spat into the gravel, his father's stories about returning from Vietnam to protests and insults coloring his reaction. Kids today don't understand respect, don't understand sacrifice. Maybe it's time they learned. "Easy, Tank," Maria said, recognizing the dangerous edge in his voice. "We're not at war with American teenagers. We're supposed to be protecting them, remember?" The tension between them was nothing new. Tank's by-the-book mentality and protective instincts toward veterans often clashed with Maria's more nuanced understanding of human behavior. Both perspectives had their place in the teams, but this situation required careful navigation. Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Officer Rebecca Martinez's name appeared on the screen, and he answered with growing unease. "Chief Morrison, this is Officer Martinez, Clearwater PD. I understand you're responding to an incident in the Maple Street area?" "That's correct, officer. Dutch Kowalski called us about vandalism to his vehicle." There was a pause, and Jake could hear the careful calculation in Martinez's voice when she continued. "Chief, I appreciate the situation, but this is a civilian matter. These are minors we're talking about. I'm already en route to speak with them." Jake looked at his team. 3 combat veterans who'd followed him through hell and trusted him to make the right call. They'd come because Dutch asked, because loyalty meant something in their world. But Martinez was right about jurisdiction, and Jake knew better than to create an incident that could reflect badly on the teams. "Understood, officer. We're not looking to interfere with your investigation, but Dutch is family to us. We'd like to be present when you speak with the kids." Another pause. "That's highly irregular, Chief." "So is vandalizing a Korean War veteran's car," Tank interjected, loud enough for Martinez to hear through the phone. Jake shot him a warning look before continuing. "Officer Martinez, these kids live-streamed their crime. There's video evidence, multiple witnesses, and significant property damage. We're not asking to conduct the interrogation. We're asking to represent Dutch's interests and maybe help these teenagers understand the magnitude of what they've done." The silence stretched, long enough for Jake to wonder if they'd lost the connection. When Martinez finally responded, her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many good intentions go wrong. 20 minutes, Maple Street. "And Chief, this stays professional." "Always does, ma'am." As Jake ended the call, Maria Santos was already pulling up social media feeds on her phone, tracking down the live stream that had documented the vandalism. Her expression grew more troubled as she watched 17-year-old Marcus Chen guide his friends through methodical destruction. "I found them," she announced, turning her phone so the others could see. Marcus Chen, Sophia Rodriguez, Tyler Williams. Local kids, not troublemakers from out of town. Tank leaned in to watch the video, his face darkening with each spray of paint, each slash of the knife through Dutch's tires. Local or not, they knew what they were doing. "Look at this, they're laughing, having fun." But Maria saw something different in the teenagers' faces. Marcus's desperate need for validation, evident in how he kept checking his view account. Sophia's reluctance, visible in her hesitant movements and the way she kept looking around as if searching for an escape. Tyler's obvious discomfort, the way he stood apart from the others, like he wanted to run. "They're scared kids making bad choices," she said quietly. "Doesn't excuse what they did, but it matters for how we handle this." Jake studied the video one more time, seeing both perspectives, Tank's righteous anger and Maria's compassionate analysis. Both were right, which made his job exponentially harder. "We roll in 15, he decided. "Maria, you take point on the family interactions. Tank, you're with me for security and presence. We show up in dress blues, full military bearing. These kids need to understand they crossed a line with someone who matters." The drive to Clearwater's residential district took 12 minutes through empty Sunday streets. Jake used the time to call Dutch, confirming he was safe and prepared for what was about to unfold. "You sure about this, Chief?" Jake asked as they turned onto Maple Street. "Once we knock on these doors, there's no going back. These families will remember this day for the rest of their lives." Dutch's voice was steady, carrying the authority of a man who'd made harder decisions in darker circumstances. "Jake, I've been watching this neighborhood change for 20 years. Good families, working people, kids who just need someone to show them that actions have consequences. Maybe we can help them understand before they do something that can't be fixed." As the team's vehicle pulled to a stop in front of the damaged Mustang, neighbors began emerging from their homes. Word had spread through the community about the vandalism, and now the sight of 3 Navy SEALs in dress blues stepping out of a military vehicle sent whispers racing from door to door. Dorothy Williams appeared on her front porch, her weathered hands gripping the railing as she watched the proceedings with keen interest. She taught high school for 35 years before raising Tyler, and she recognized the look of adults who were about to deliver life-changing consequences to young people who thought they were untouchable. Jake Morrison straightened his uniform blouse and checked his watch. In 5 minutes, 3 teenagers would discover that their moment of viral fame had attracted attention they never expected. The question wasn't whether their lives would be different after today. It was whether that difference would destroy them or save them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to chime the hour. Time for a reckoning that would test everyone's understanding of justice, mercy, and the price of redemption. The morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to chime the hour. "So is vandalizing a Korean War veteran's car," Tank interjected, loud enough for Martinez to hear through the phone. Jake shot him a warning look before continuing. "Officer Martinez, these kids live-streamed their crime. There's video evidence, multiple witnesses, and significant property damage. We're not asking to conduct the interrogation. We're asking to represent Dutch's interests and maybe help these teenagers understand the magnitude of what they've done." The silence stretched, long enough for Jake to wonder if they'd lost the connection. When Martinez finally responded, her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many good intentions go wrong. 20 minutes, Maple Street, and Chief, this stays professional. Always does, ma'am. As Jake ended the call, Maria Santos was already pulling up social media feeds on her phone, tracking down the live stream that had documented the vandalism. Her expression grew more troubled as she watched 17-year-old Marcus Chen guide his friends through methodical destruction. "I found them," she announced, turning her phone so the others could see. "Marcus Chen, Sophia Rodriguez, Tyler Williams, local kids, not troublemakers from out of town." Tank leaned in to watch the video, his face darkening with each spray of paint, each slash of the knife through Dutch's tires. Local or not, they knew what they were doing. "Look at this. They're laughing, having fun." But Maria saw something different in the teenagers' faces. Marcus's desperate need for validation, evident in how he kept checking his viewer count. Sophia's reluctance, visible in her hesitant movements and the way she kept looking around as if searching for an escape. Tyler's obvious discomfort, the way he stood apart from the others, like he wanted to run. "They're scared kids making bad choices," she said quietly. "Doesn't excuse what they did, but it matters for how we handle this." Jake studied the video one more time, seeing both perspectives, Tank's righteous anger and Maria's compassionate analysis. Both were right, which made his job exponentially harder. "We roll in 15, he decided. "Maria, you take point on the family interactions. Tank, you're with me for security and presence. We show up in dress blues, full military bearing. These kids need to understand they crossed a line with someone who matters." The drive to Clearwater's residential district took 12 minutes through empty Sunday streets. Jake used the time to call Dutch, confirming he was safe and prepared for what was about to unfold. "You sure about this, Chief?" Jake asked as they turned onto Maple Street. "Once we knock on these doors, there's no going back. These families will remember this day for the rest of their lives." Dutch's voice was steady, carrying the authority of a man who'd made harder decisions in darker circumstances. "Jake, I've been watching this neighborhood change for 20 years. Good families, working people, kids who just need someone to show them that actions have consequences. Maybe we can help them understand before they do something that can't be fixed." As the team's vehicle pulled to a stop in front of the damaged Mustang, neighbors began emerging from their homes. Word had spread through the community about the vandalism, and now the sight of 3 Navy SEALs in dress blues stepping out of a military vehicle sent whispers racing from door to door. Dorothy Williams appeared on her front porch, her weathered hands gripping the railing as she watched the proceedings with keen interest. She taught high school for 35 years before raising Tyler, and she recognized the look of adults who were about to deliver life-changing consequences to young people who thought they were untouchable. Jake Morrison straightened his uniform blouse and checked his watch. In 5 minutes, 3 teenagers would discover that their moment of viral fame had attracted attention they never expected. The question wasn't whether their lives would be different after today. It was whether that difference would destroy them or save them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to chime the hour. Time for a reckoning that would test everyone's understanding of justice, mercy, and the price of redemption. The morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to chime the hour. Time for a reckoning that would test everyone's understanding of justice, mercy, and the price of redemption. Marcus Chen was still in bed when the doorbell rang at precisely 0800 hours. His mother had left for her morning shift at Tampa General 30 minutes earlier, leaving him alone in their modest apartment with nothing but the fading satisfaction of his viral moment and a growing unease he couldn't name. The second ring was more insistent. Marcus rolled out of bed, pulled on yesterday's clothes, and shuffled to the door, expecting a package delivery, or maybe Mrs. Patterson from downstairs complaining about noise again. He opened the door to find 3 Navy SEALs in dress blues standing in the hallway like an honor guard. The lead man, tall, weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to life and death decisions, studied Marcus with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his appearance. His posture, his sudden shift from casual annoyance to wide-eyed terror. Marcus Chen? Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men straighten their spines. Yeah? Marcus's voice cracked on the single syllable, his earlier bravado evaporating. Like morning mist. I'm Chief Morrison. This is Petty Officer Santos and Petty Officer Johnson. We need to discuss your activities last night. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. His live stream had only reached 100 viewers at its peak. How had it attracted military attention? His heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped aside to let them enter, his hands shaking with the knowledge that his moment of viral fame had somehow escalated beyond his worst nightmares. 2 miles across town, Sofia Rodriguez was helping her mother prepare for another Sunday of single parenting when the SEALs arrived at their front door. Maria Rodriguez opened it expecting the postal service or maybe a neighbor, not 3 military personnel who looked like they'd stepped out of a recruitment poster. Mrs. Rodriguez, we're here about your daughter Sofia. The words hit Maria Rodriguez like a physical blow. Her husband was somewhere in Afghanistan, serving his 3rd deployment, while she held their family together through sheer will and determination. Now military personnel were on her doorstep, and her first terrified thought was that something had happened to Roberto. "Is my husband?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, your husband is fine," Maria Santos said quickly, recognizing the panic of a military spouse. "We're here about a local incident involving your daughter." Sofia appeared behind her mother, already dressed for church, her artistic hands twisted together in guilty recognition. She'd spent the sleepless hours since the vandalism replaying every moment, seeing her father's face in her mind, imagining his disappointment when he learned what she'd done with the freedom he was fighting to protect. "Mija," her mother said, softly, understanding flooding her features. "What did you do?" Meanwhile, Tyler Williams was sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate, while Dorothy Williams watched him with the keen observation of someone who'd spent decades reading the faces of troubled teenagers. "You didn't sleep," she said, not asking. Tyler's response was interrupted by the doorbell. Dorothy rose with the careful movements of age, her instincts already alert to the possibility that whatever had kept her grandson awake was about to manifest on her doorstep. She opened the door to find Jake Morrison flanked by his team, their presence immediately transforming her quiet Sunday morning into something that would define the rest of Tyler's life. "Mrs. Williams, we need to speak with Tyler about an incident last night." Dorothy's teacher instincts kicked in, the ability to assess a situation and understand its implications within seconds. She looked past the uniforms to see the men beneath, noting Jake's careful posture, Maria's empathetic expression. Tank's barely contained anger. "Tyler!" she called, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Come here, please." Tyler appeared in the doorway, his lanky frame shrinking under the weight of 3 sets of military eyes. His learning disabilities had always made him struggle with authority figures, but these weren't teachers or principals. These were combat veterans whose very presence seemed to demand honesty. "Did you hurt someone?" Dorothy asked directly, her teaching experience telling her to cut through confusion and get to the core of the issue. "No, ma'am," Tyler whispered. We vandalized a car." "Whose car?" The question came from Jake Morrison, though he already knew the answer. Tyler's eyes filled with tears as the magnitude of his choices crashed over him like a wave. "An old man's. We didn't know. We thought it was just some random car." Dorothy Williams felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew every car in the neighborhood, knew every neighbor's story, and she had a terrible suspicion about which old man Tyler was referring to. Across town, Marcus Chen sat in his living room facing 3 Navy SEALs while his world crumbled around him. Jake Morrison had explained the situation with military precision, the victim, the damage, the implications, while Marcus struggled to understand how his quest for social media fame had led to this moment. "Harold Kowalski," Jake continued, his voice carrying decades of respect and affection, served in Korea when he was 17 years old, came home, became a Navy SEAL instructor, trained hundreds of military personnel over 20 years. The car you vandalized was a restoration project he worked on with his late wife. Each word hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd expected consequences, maybe community service, possibly juvenile court. He hadn't expected to learn that his victim was a war hero whose life story made Marcus's problem seem pathetically small. "We don't want to press charges," Maria Santos said, her voice gentler than her teammates. "But we can't ignore what happened either. Mr. Kowalski has asked us to offer you 3 an alternative." Marcus looked up, hope and fear warring in his expression. "What kind of alternative?" "Community service under military supervision," Jake replied. "You'll report to Mr. Kowalski's house every day after school for the next month. You'll repair the damage you caused, learn about the man you hurt, and hopefully understand why your actions matter." Tank Johnson leaned forward, his voice carrying warning. "Or you can face vandalism charges, destruction of property, and whatever else the district attorney wants to throw at you. Your choice." The weight of decision pressed down on Marcus like gravity itself. He thought about his parents, working multiple jobs to keep their family afloat. He thought about college applications and his uncertain future. He thought about the old man whose car they'd destroyed, whose story he was only beginning to understand. Similar conversations were happening across Clearwater as Sophia and Tyler faced the same choice. 3 teenagers who'd thought themselves invisible were learning that every action creates ripples, that every choice carries weight, that some consequences can't be undone but might, with enough work and genuine remorse, be transformed into something meaningful. The SEALs left each home with the same message: 24 hours to decide. Criminal charges or community service, the legal system or an opportunity to make things right. As Jake Morrison's team regrouped at the damaged Mustang, Dutch Kowalski, emerged from his house. The morning sun illuminated the spray paint and slashed tires, but it also revealed something else, an old man's dignity intact despite the assault on his property, his bearing straight despite his age, his eyes clear, with purpose despite the confusion that increasingly clouded his days. "How'd they take it?" Dutch asked. Jake studied his mentor's face, seeing both strength and vulnerability in features weathered by decades of service and sacrifice. "They're scared." "That's good. Scared means they're still capable of learning." Dutch nodded, his gaze fixed on the memorial to his marriage that now looked like a crime scene. "Good. Fear keeps you alive long enough to grow wisdom. These kids need both." The next 24 hours would determine whether three teenagers chose the easy path of legal consequences, or the harder road of facing the man they'd wronged. Either way, their lives had been irrevocably changed by the discovery that actions have consequences, that victims have stories, and that sometimes redemption requires more courage than the original sin. The next 24 hours would determine whether three teenagers chose the easy path of legal consequences or the harder road of facing the man they'd wronged. Either way, their lives had been irrevocably changed by the discovery that actions have consequences, that victims have stories, and that sometimes redemption requires more courage than the original sin. That evening, Marcus Chen sat in the parking lot behind Clearwater Mall, his beat-up Honda Civic forming a triangle with Tyler's grandmother's ancient Buick and Sophia's mother's Toyota. The three teenagers had texted frantically throughout the day, their usual bravado replaced by shared terror and desperate need for connection. "My mom's going to kill me," Sophia said for the 5th time, her artistic hands shredding a paper coffee cup. "When she finds out what we did. Nah, and if it gets back to my dad somehow." Her voice trailed off, but Marcus and Tyler understood. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was serving his 3rd deployment, trusting his family to hold things together while he fought for principles his daughter had casually vandalized. Tyler shifted in the driver's seat of his grandmother's car, his learning disabilities making it harder to process the rapid-fire conversation. But his emotional intelligence, often sharper than his academic skills, picked up on something the others missed. "Did you guys see the way that Lady Seal looked at us?" he asked quietly. Not angry, more like, sad. Marcus replayed the morning's encounter, remembering Petty Officer Santos's expression when she'd explained their options. "What do you mean?" "Like she understood something we don't," Tyler continued, his voice gaining confidence. "Like she's been where we are." Their speculation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with yet another notification. His vandalism livestream had continued gaining views throughout the day, but the comments had shifted from encouragement to judgment as word spread about Dutch Kowalski's identity. "Listen to this," Marcus read, his voice bitter. "These punks destroyed a war hero's car for likes, hope they get everything they deserve." 47 likes on that comment. Sophia looked up from her destroyed coffee cup. "At least they don't know our names." "Yet," Tyler added ominously. Across town, Dr. Emily Chen was discovering her son's involvement in the worst possible way. She'd returned from her 16-hour hospital shift to find 3 missed calls from Marcus's school, 2 voicemails from neighbors, and a text from her son that simply read, "Mum, we need to talk. It's bad." She sat in her car outside their apartment complex, still wearing scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion, reading news articles about the vandalism on her phone, the Korean War veterans' car, the military response, her son's name mentioned in connection with destruction of property and disrespect to a man who'd served his country with honor. Emily Chen had immigrated to America at age 12, her parents chasing dreams of opportunity and success. She'd worked through medical school, while raising Marcus largely alone, his father having departed when the responsibilities of parenthood clashed with his other priorities. Every choice she'd made had been about giving Marcus opportunities she'd never had. Now she wondered if her absence, all those nights at the hospital, all those weekends catching up on paperwork, had created the emptiness her son had tried to fill with social media validation and destructive behavior. When she finally climbed the stairs to their apartment, she found Marcus sitting at their small kitchen table, his laptop open to his bank account page. "I've got $347, he said without looking up. "From my part-time job at the mall. I know it won't cover the damage, but it's a start." Emily set down her medical bag and studied her son's face. The cocky teenager who'd left for school that morning had been replaced by someone older, more thoughtful, weighted down by consequences he was only beginning to understand. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into the chair across from him. Meanwhile, Dorothy Williams was having her own difficult conversation. She'd spent the afternoon researching Harold Kowalski, piecing together a story that made her heart ache for both the old man and her grandson. "Tyler," she said, settling onto the couch beside him with a photo album she'd retrieved from her closet. "I want to show you something." The album contained pictures from her teaching career, decades of students, school events, community gatherings. She turned to a page from 1995, pointing to a photograph of a Memorial Day ceremony at Clearwater High School. "That's Mr. Kowalski," she said, indicating a younger version of Dutch standing beside the school's flagpole. "He came to speak to my history class about the Korean War. Brought medals, photographs, stories about friends who didn't come home." Tyler studied the photograph, seeing Dutch Kowalski as he'd been 28 years ago, still bearing the posture of military service, but with Eleanor beside him, both of them smiling at the camera with the contentment of people who'd found their place in the world. "He talked about respect," Dorothy continued, "about how freedom isn't free, how every generation has to decide what they're willing to sacrifice to preserve it. Your grandfather would have liked him." The mention of Tyler's grandfather, killed in a car accident along with Tyler's parents 5 years ago, brought tears to his eyes. His learning disabilities made school difficult, but his emotional intelligence was sharp enough to understand the parallels Dorothy was drawing. At the Rodriguez house, mother and daughter sat in their small living room, surrounded by evidence of the military family's sacrifice, deployment calendars, care packages ready to ship overseas, photographs of Roberto Rodriguez in his army uniform. "Mija," Maria Rodriguez said softly, "your father chose to serve because he believes in something bigger than himself. When you vandalized that veteran's car, you attacked the very thing he's fighting to protect." Sophia's artistic eye catalogued the room's contents: the folded flag from her grandfather's funeral, the shadow box containing her father's medals, the pictures of military ceremonies and family gatherings, interrupted by deployment schedules. "I was angry," she admitted finally. "Angry that he's gone again. Angry that everyone talks about military families making sacrifices, but nobody asks us kids if we want to make them." Her mother's expression softened with understanding. "Being angry is normal, Misha, but what you do with that anger, that's what defines you." As Sunday evening faded into night, the three teenagers made their decision through a group text that took 47 minutes to compose. Marcus: "We take the community service." Sophia: "Agreed. We face what we did." Tyler: "Together." Marcus: "Together." The decision was transmitted to Chief Morrison at 2147 hours, his phone buzzing as he reviewed personnel files at the Naval Reserve Center. Jake Morrison had spent the day making his own difficult calls to his commanding officer, explaining the situation and requesting permission for extended civilian engagement. To Dutch Kowalski, confirming the old man's readiness for what was about to unfold, to Officer Martinez, coordinating their approach to ensure everything remained legal and appropriate. "Sir," Maria Santos said, looking up from her own research, "I've been reading about these kids. Marcus Chen, straight-A student, until this year, works part-time, parents both working multiple jobs. Sofia Rodriguez, military family, father deployed, artistic talent that her teachers describe as exceptional. Tyler Williams, learning disabilities, lost his parents in a car accident, being raised by his grandmother who's a retired teacher." Jake nodded, unsurprised by the complexity that lurked beneath surface-level vandalism. "What's your assessment?" "They're not bad kids," Maria replied. "They're lost kids. Big difference." Tank Johnson looked up from his own paperwork. Background checks on the families, criminal records that showed no previous serious offenses, school records that painted pictures of teenagers struggling with circumstances beyond their control. "Doesn't change what they did," he said, but his tone lacked its earlier edge. "No," Jake agreed, "but it changes how we handle what comes next." The stage was set for an unlikely alliance between combat veterans and troubled teenagers, mediated by an 88-year-old Korean War veteran whose damaged car had become the catalyst for something none of them could have predicted. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a month-long journey that would test everyone's understanding of justice, redemption, and the possibility that healing could emerge from destruction. Dutch Kowalski sat in his living room, looking out at his vandalized Mustang, and wondered if he had enough time left, enough clarity remaining, to teach 3 young people lessons that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Dutch Kowalski sat in his living room, looking out at his vandalized Mustang, and wondered if he had enough time left, enough clarity remaining, to teach 3 young people lessons that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Monday morning arrived with the humidity that made Florida summers legendary. At precisely 1500 hours, 3 teenagers stood on Dutch Kowalski's front porch, their collective anxiety palpable in the thick air. Marcus Chen clutched a manila folder containing printouts of car restoration estimates and his bank account statement. Sofia Rodriguez held a sketchpad she'd filled with design ideas for covering the graffiti. Tyler Williams carried his grandmother's toolbox, the weight of it grounding him as he fought his usual anxiety around new situations. Jake Morrison emerged from his rental car at the curb, his civilian clothes doing nothing to diminish his command presence. Behind him, Maria Santos carried a medical bag, standard protocol when working with elderly civilians, while Tank Johnson surveyed the neighborhood with the automatic awareness of someone trained to assess potential threats. Dutch opened the door before anyone could knock, his military bearing intact, despite the tremor in his hands. At 88, he remained imposing, 6 feet of Korean War veteran who'd spent 20 years training Navy SEALs. But the teenagers could see something. Fragile in his eyes, moments of confusion that flickered like faulty electrical connections. "You decided to come," Dutch said, his voice carrying approval mixed with challenge. "Good. Shows character." The awkward introductions were interrupted when Dutch suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on something beyond their understanding. For 30 seconds, he stood motionless, lost in a memory or moment that existed outside the present. The teenagers exchanged worried glances until Jake Morrison gently touched Dutch's shoulder. "Chief, the kids are here for their first day." Dutch's eyes cleared, snapping back to the present with military precision. "Right, the car. Let's assess the damage." Walking to the Mustang was like approaching a crime scene. The spray paint looked even worse in daylight, electric blue and hot pink profanity covering the hood and doors, artistic but destructive. The slashed tires had been replaced, courtesy of Jake Morrison's personal funds, but the broken taillight and cracked windshield remained as evidence of the destruction. This was a 1967 Mustang fastback, Dutch began, his voice taking on the cadence of an instructor. Factory 390 big block, 4-speed transmission. Eleanor and I bought it in 1995 for $8,000. Spent 3 years restoring every bolt, every piece of chrome. Sophia found herself studying Dutch's face as he spoke, her artistic eye capturing the way his features softened when he mentioned his wife. Was she? Did she like cars? Eleanor liked projects, Dutch replied, a genuine smile breaking through his stern expression. Said working with your hands kept your mind sharp, kept your heart connected to something real. She did the interior work. Every stitch of that leather seat covering was done by hand. Marcus stepped closer to examine the vandalized upholstery, seeing for the first time the meticulous craftsmanship his spray paint had defaced. How long did the restoration take? 3 years. Every weekend, some evenings, Eleanor would bring sandwiches to the garage, and we'd work until dark. Dutch's voice carried the weight of precious memories. Best conversations of our marriage happened over engine parts and paint samples. The revelation hit the teenagers like cold water. This wasn't just property damage, it was the destruction of love made tangible, of shared dreams crystallized in metal and chrome. Tyler, whose learning disabilities often made him struggle with academic concepts, found himself understanding something profound about loss and value. Where do we start fixing it? Dutch studied Tyler's earnest face, recognizing something familiar in the young man's careful attention to detail, despite his obvious struggles with processing information. We start by understanding what we're fixing. Maria, you got those photos Jake sent? Maria Santos produced printed screenshots from Marcus's live stream. The evidence of their crime laid out in full color. Watching themselves vandalize the car was exponentially worse than committing the act. The casual destruction, the laughter, the complete disconnection from consequences. I want each of you to tell me what you see in these pictures, Dutch commanded, his instructor persona taking over. Not what you did. What you see. Marcus went first, his voice barely above a whisper. I see someone who thought getting attention was more important than respecting other people's property. I see someone using talent for destruction instead of creation, Sophia added, staring at her elaborate graffiti with growing shame. Tyler studied the images longer, his processing differences requiring more time, but often producing deeper insights. I see someone who was so worried about belonging that he forgot about right and wrong. Dutch nodded approvingly. Good. Recognition is the first step toward redemption. Now let's talk about what this car represents. What followed was the beginning of an education none of them had expected. Dutch led them into his garage, which was more military museum than workspace. The walls were covered with photographs, Korean War battles, SEAL training classes, military ceremonies spanning 5 decades. This is Chosin Reservoir, November 1950, Dutch said, pointing to a black and white photograph of soldiers in winter gear. 17 degrees below zero, surrounded by Chinese forces. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, but responsible for 8 other Marines who were counting on me to get them home. The teenagers studied the faces in the photograph, young men not much older than themselves, facing circumstances they could barely comprehend. 6 of those 8 made it home, Dutch continued. The other 2 are buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Jimmy Patterson from Ohio, Danny Rodriguez from New Mexico, good kids who died protecting principles they probably couldn't have explained, but understood in their hearts. Sophia looked up sharply at the mention of the name Rodriguez. Danny Rodriguez. Might have been your grandfather, Mija, Dutch said, noting her reaction. A lot of Rodriguez families served with honor. That's the thing about military service. It connects generations, connects families to something bigger than individual wants and needs. The garage tour continued with Dutch sharing stories from his time as a SEAL instructor. photographs of training classes, commendation letters, medals earned by students he'd taught. The teenagers began to understand that the man whose car they'd vandalized wasn't just an elderly neighbor. He was a living connection to history, a teacher whose influence had shaped hundreds of military careers. Eleanor used to say I collected people the way other folks collected stamps, Dutch said, pausing before a wall of wedding invitations from former students. Every kid I trained became family. Dozens of weddings, hundreds of graduations, more grandchildren than I can count. All because teaching never ends. It just gets passed forward. Marcus found himself studying Dutch's instructor methodologies, recognizing leadership principles he'd never encountered in school. How did you know which students would succeed? I didn't, Dutch replied honestly. But I learned that success wasn't about natural talent or physical strength. It was about who they became when everything went wrong, when failure seemed certain, when giving up would have been easier than continuing. The afternoon session ended with Dutch assigning specific tasks for the week ahead. Marcus would research Korean War history and write reports on major battles. Sophia would study military art and memorial design, channeling her talents toward understanding rather than destruction. Tyler would document Dutch's stories, using his emotional intelligence to preserve memories that might otherwise be lost to time. As the teenagers prepared to leave, Dutch had another moment of confusion, staring at the Mustang as if seeing it for the first time, his face clouded with uncertainty about where he was and why the car was damaged. Jake Morrison stepped forward again, providing gentle reorientation. Chief, the kids will be back tomorrow, same time, same mission. Dutch's clarity returned, but the incident left everyone unsettled. The man they were learning to respect and admire was fighting his own battle against time and memory, making their opportunity to learn from him even more precious and urgent. As they walked away from Dutch's house, the three teenagers carried more than homework assignments. They carried the weight of understanding that some damage couldn't be undone, some opportunities wouldn't last forever, and some teachers were irreplaceable. Tomorrow would bring new lessons about honor, sacrifice, and the possibility that redemption might require more courage than any of them possessed. Tomorrow would bring new lessons about honor, sacrifice, and the possibility that redemption might require more courage than any of them possessed. The breaking point came during the third week of their community service, at what should have been a celebration. Dorothy Williams had organized a neighborhood barbecue to showcase the teenagers' progress. The Mustang's restoration was nearly complete, and the community had begun to embrace the unlikely mentorship unfolding in their midst. Dutch stood beside his gleaming car, accepting congratulations from neighbors who'd watched the transformation with growing admiration. The teenagers had worked tirelessly, their initial reluctance replaced by genuine dedication. Marcus had become Dutch's unofficial historian. Sophia's artistic talents had transformed repairs into beautiful restoration work, and Tyler's careful attention ensured every detail reflected original specifications. Dr. Emily Chen arrived straight from her hospital shift, still wearing scrubs, but determined to witness her son's progress. She'd watched Marcus change over the past weeks, his direction becoming clearer as Dutch's mentorship provided structure his academic life had lacked. "Mrs. Chen," Dutch said, approaching with careful steps, "your son has exceptional leadership potential. Reminds me of some of my best students." The conversation was interrupted when Dutch suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his eyes losing focus, as confusion washed over his features. Emily's medical training immediately recognized the signs: spatial disorientation, temporal displacement, cognitive disruption indicating more than simple aging. "Mr. Kowalski," she said gently, checking his pulse, "are you feeling all right?" Dutch's response came from decades in the past, his voice carrying combat urgency. "Sergeant Chen, We need to establish a perimeter. Chinese forces are moving through the valley, and we're cut off from the main unit." The barbecue fell silent as neighbors realized something was seriously wrong. Dutch's military bearing remained intact, but he was clearly experiencing an episode that transported him back to Korea, to battles fought when he was younger than the teenagers surrounding him. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, recognizing leadership responsibility. "Chief Kowalski, this is Marcus Chen reporting. The perimeter is secure, sir. All personnel accounted for." The response was intuitive, Marcus drawing on weeks of learning Dutch's military protocols to provide structured communication that might reach through the confusion. Dutch's eyes sharpened slightly, focusing on Marcus with intensity. "Chen, you're not Sergeant Chen. He was killed at Chosin, November 28th, 1950. "No, sir," Marcus replied steadily. "I'm Marcus Chen, your student. It's May 2024, and we're in Florida." Jake Morrison materialized beside them, his SEAL training providing medical emergency protocols. "Chief, you're at home. You're safe. The war ended 70 years ago." But Dutch's confusion deepened, his voice rising with panic. "Where's Eleanor? She was right here. We were working on the car, and where did she go?" The question hit everyone like a physical blow. Eleanor Kowalski had died 5 years ago, but in Dutch's confused state, her absence was fresh trauma rather than processed grief. Sophia stepped forward, her artistic empathy providing insight. "Mr. Kowalski, Eleanor would be so proud of what you've accomplished. The car is beautiful. The work you did together, it's perfect." Her words seemed to anchor Dutch momentarily, his mind focusing on the concrete reality of the restored Mustang. But the respite was brief, replaced by increasing agitation as he struggled to understand why his wife wasn't beside him. Dr. Chen's medical assessment was rapid: elevated pulse, disorientation, short-term memory disruption combined with vivid long-term recall. The symptoms pointed toward moderate cognitive decline, possibly exacerbated by stress and recent emotional intensity. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, drawing Jake aside, "has he been experiencing episodes like this regularly?" Jake's expression revealed the weight of knowledge he'd been carrying, more frequently over the past 6 months, usually minor, forgetting names, losing track of time. Nothing like this. "He needs comprehensive medical evaluation," Emily said, her professional objectivity warring with personal concern. "This level of disorientation, it's not safe for him to live alone." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Dutch required assisted living, their mentorship program would end. The teenagers would lose their teacher just as they were beginning to understand his lessons. Tyler Williams approached Dutch with characteristic gentleness. "Mr. Kowalski, would you like to sit down? We can look at the photo albums while everyone else finishes eating." The suggestion worked where medical intervention had failed. Dutch allowed himself to be guided to a lawn chair, his confusion gradually clearing as Tyler produced albums that had become central to their educational sessions. "This is Korea," Dutch said, his voice steadying as he pointed to familiar photographs. "Winter of 1950, coldest campaign of my life." As Dutch began recounting the story, details sharp despite his recent confusion, the adults held their own difficult conversation. Emily Chen explained cognitive decline to people who'd come to depend on Dutch's wisdom and guidance. "What does this mean for the program?" Maria Santos asked. "It means we adapt," Jake Morrison replied. "Dutch is still Dutch even when he's confused. The lessons are still valid, but we need more support structure, more supervision." Sophia looked up from beside Dutch. "What if he forgets us? What if he forgets everything we've learned together?" Dutch's voice cut through their conversation, his clarity returning. "I may forget where I put my keys, but I'll never forget what you kids have become. Character isn't stored in memory, it's built into who you are. The teenagers realized their education was entering a new phase, one where they might become Dutch's protectors rather than just his students, where their growth would be measured by how they applied lessons to care for their teacher. The teenagers realized their education was entering a new phase, one where they might become Dutch's protectors rather than just his students, where their growth would be measured by how they applied lessons to care for their teacher. The crisis exploded 3 days later when Marcus's original livestream video resurfaced on TikTok with the caption, "Spoiled brats vandalize war hero's car, get coddled by Navy SEALs instead of real punishment." Within 6 hours, it had garnered 50,000 views and comments ranging from outraged to vicious. Marcus discovered the viral explosion during lunch at Clearwater High, his phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. Students he'd never spoken to suddenly knew his name, his face, his moment of destructive stupidity preserved forever in digital amber. "Marcus Chen thinks he's above consequences," one comment read. "Military brat gets special treatment while real kids face real punishment." The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being attacked for privilege he'd never possessed by people who knew nothing about his family's struggles or his genuine remorse. Sophia found herself cornered in the art room by classmates who'd seen her elaborate graffiti skills documented in high definition. "So you're the one who thinks defacing memorials makes you an artist?" sneered Jessica Martinez, whose own artistic talents had never gained recognition. "That's not what happened," Sophia tried to explain, but the viral narrative had already crystallized into unshakable opinion. Tyler faced the cruelest treatment at home, where Dorothy Williams fielded angry phone calls from community members who felt the teenagers should face traditional juvenile justice rather than military coddling. "Mrs. Williams," came one particularly harsh voicemail, "your grandson destroyed a veteran's property and you're treating it like summer camp." Some of us remember when actions had real consequences. The social media firestorm reached national attention when conservative blogger Patricia Kellerman picked up the story, framing it as evidence of America's declining respect for military service and veterans. Her blog post, titled "When Vandalism Gets Rewarded, the Dutch Kowalski Disgrace," painted the mentorship program as misguided liberal justice that prioritized feelings over accountability. Jake Morrison received the call from his commanding officer at 600 hours on Thursday morning. Colonel Richard's voice carried the weight of institutional displeasure and political pressure. "Chief Morrison, I'm getting inquiries from congressional offices about your unauthorized community engagement. Some people are questioning whether active duty personnel should be involved in civilian juvenile matters. Sir, this is a mentorship program for at-risk youth, conducted during off-duty hours with a Korean War veteran who served—" "I don't care if he served with MacArthur himself," Richards interrupted. "You've got 48 hours to wrap this up and return to standard duties. The optics are becoming problematic." The order felt like abandonment of Dutch, of the teenagers, of principles that had guided Jake's entire military career. But military orders weren't suggestions, and his team's careers depended on compliance. Dutch learned about the viral controversy in the worst possible way. Margaret Patterson from down the street arrived at his door with printouts of online comments, her face flushed with righteous indignation. "Dutch, these people are saying terrible things about you, about the kids. They're calling you senile, saying you can't make good decisions anymore." The attack on his mental competence hit harder than criticism of his methods. Dutch had spent months hiding his cognitive struggles, maintaining dignity through sheer will. Now strangers were diagnosing his condition based on 20-second video clips. That afternoon, when the teenagers arrived for their regular session, They found Dutch sitting in his garage, surrounded by decades of military memorabilia, his expression carrying defeat rather than determination. "Maybe they're right," he said, quietly. "Maybe I'm too old to know what's best anymore." Marcus felt something ignite in his chest, protective fury he'd never experienced before. "They don't know you. They don't know us. They don't know what we've learned here." Sophia pulled out her phone, navigating to the comments section with growing anger. "Listen to this. Old fool probably has dementia. Shouldn't be making decisions about criminal justice. These people are attacking you for showing us mercy." Tyler's learning disabilities had taught him to recognize emotional truth beneath surface complexity. "Mr. Kowalski, when you were in Korea, did people back home understand what you were fighting for?" Dutch looked up, recognizing the parallel Tyler was drawing. Most didn't. They saw news reports, casualty numbers, political arguments, but they weren't there. They didn't know the individual soldiers, the daily choices, the real cost of freedom. "Same thing here," Tyler continued. "These people see a video and think they understand everything. But they weren't here for the past month. They didn't see Marcus research Korean war battles until midnight. They didn't see Sophia learn to honor military art instead of destroying it. They didn't see any of us change." Jake Morrison arrived as the teenagers were rallying around their mentor, his own conflict evident in his bearing. The military order to disengage warred with personal loyalty and witnessed transformation. "Chief," he said to Dutch, "I've got orders to conclude this operation. Command doesn't want active duty personnel involved in civilian controversies." Dutch's military training understood the reality of orders and institutional pressure, but his instructor instincts recognized that some lessons couldn't be abandoned midstream without losing their transformative power. "Jake, these kids aren't ready. They've learned discipline and respect, but they haven't learned courage yet. Real courage, standing up for what's right when the whole world is telling you you're wrong." The words hung in the garage like a challenge. The teenagers had experienced redemption through service, but now they faced their first test of character under fire, defending their mentor and their transformation against a hostile world that preferred simple justice to complex mercy. Outside, media vans were beginning to arrive in the neighborhood, drawn by the viral controversy and political implications. The quiet suburban street, where 3 teenagers had once vandalized a car for social media attention, was about to become ground zero for a national debate about justice, mercy, and the price of second chances. Outside, media vans were beginning to arrive in the neighborhood, drawn by the viral controversy and political implications. The quiet suburban street where 3 teenagers had once vandalized a car for social media attention was about to become ground zero for a national debate about justice, mercy, and the price of second chances. By Friday morning, Clearwater's Oak Ridge Drive looked like a crime scene crossed with a carnival. 3 news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking signal instead of sun. Reporters clutched coffee cups and practiced sound bites, while camera operators tested equipment angles for optimal shots of Dutch's house. Patricia Kellerman arrived in a black SUV with Maryland plates, her blog's viral success having earned her appearances on conservative talk radio and cable news programs. She wore a navy blazer and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd discovered that outrage could be monetized. "This is exactly what's wrong with America," she announced to Channel 8's morning reporter, gesturing toward Dutch's house. "We've replaced accountability with therapy, justice with feelings. These vandals should be in juvenile detention, not getting participation trophies from the military." Dutch watched the circus from his living room window, his confusion about recent events mixing with clear memories of other times when strangers had judged situations they didn't understand. Korea had taught him that battles often got fought in places where civilians couldn't see the real cost, couldn't comprehend the complexity of choices made under pressure. The teenagers arrived together at their usual time, having coordinated their approach through frantic text messages. They decided to enter through Dutch's backyard, avoiding the media gauntlet on the front street, but reporters had anticipated this strategy. "Marcus Chen," called Sarah Davidson from Channel 10, thrusting a microphone toward him as he tried to navigate around camera equipment. "Do you feel like you've faced real consequences for vandalizing a veteran's car?" Marcus stopped walking, his weeks of learning from Dutch crystallizing into a moment of choice. He could duck his head, mumble apologies, and disappear into the backyard. Or he could stand and speak the truth he'd learned, regardless of how it might be edited or taken out of context. "I've learned more about honor and sacrifice in the past month than I learned in 17 years before that," he said, his voice steady despite the cameras. "Mr. Kowalski didn't give us a free pass. He gave us a chance to understand what we'd actually done and why it mattered." "But don't you think jail time would have been more appropriate?" Davidson pressed. Sophia stepped forward, her artist's eye noting how the cameras framed their faces to emphasize youth and inexperience rather than the growth and maturity they'd developed. "You want to know what's appropriate? Mr. Kowalski served his country for decades, lost friends in combat, spent 20 years training other people to defend freedom. When 3 kids made a stupid mistake that hurt him personally, he chose to teach instead of punish. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that makes America worth defending." Tyler, whose learning disabilities often made him struggle with rapid-fire questions, found his voice strengthened by moral clarity. "People are calling Mr. Kowalski senile for showing us mercy. But mercy isn't a sign of mental decline. It's a sign of wisdom. You have to be really smart to know when justice matters more than revenge." The sound bites were perfect for evening. News, articulate, passionate, defendable, but the teenagers knew that media narratives had their own momentum, often independent of truth or context. Inside Dutch's house, Jake Morrison was having the most difficult conversation of his military career. His phone displayed a text from Colonel Richards. "Saw the news coverage. You have 6 hours to extract your team and end this operation. No exceptions." "Chief," Jake said to Dutch, his voice carrying the weight of impossible choices, "I've got to follow orders, but that doesn't mean this has to end." Dutch's instructor instincts understood the position Jake was in, caught between institutional demands and personal loyalty, between career preservation and moral obligation. It was a familiar conflict for military personnel, the eternal tension between following orders and doing what felt right. "Jake, you've got your own chain of command to consider, but these kids—" Dutch paused, his thoughts organizing themselves with military precision despite his recent cognitive struggles. "They're at a critical point in their development. If we abandon them now, under fire, we teach them that principles only matter when they're convenient." Maria Santos, who'd been quietly documenting the teenagers' progress for potential replication in other communities, faced her own career crossroads. Her commanding officer had made it clear that continued involvement could impact her advancement prospects. "What if we transition this to civilian oversight?" she suggested. "Mrs. Williams has teaching experience. Dr. Chen has professional credentials. They could continue the mentorship program without military involvement." Tank Johnson, whose initial skepticism about the program had evolved into genuine respect for Dutch and the teenagers, struggled with the idea of walking away. "These aren't just kids anymore. They're soldiers in their own way, fighting for something bigger than themselves." The metaphor wasn't lost on Dutch, who'd spent decades watching young people transform under pressure, learning to choose courage over comfort. That's exactly what they are. And soldiers don't abandon their mission when the enemy starts shooting. By afternoon, the media attention had attracted counter-protesters, veterans groups who supported Dutch's approach, educators who understood the value of restorative justice, and community members who'd witnessed the teenagers' transformation firsthand. Oak Ridge Drive became a battlefield of competing narratives about justice, mercy, and the best way to guide young people who'd made serious mistakes. Dorothy Williams emerged from her house carrying a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, positioning herself directly between the media crews and Dutch's front door. At 74, she'd taught enough troubled teenagers to recognize the difference between accountability and destruction. "Y'all can film and interview and pontificate all you want," she announced to the assembled reporters, "but you're not harassing that man or those children while I'm breathing." Her defiance sparked something in the neighborhood. Mr. Patterson, from next door, joined her with his own chair. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with Sophia's younger siblings in tow, creating a human barrier of people who'd actually witnessed the month-long transformation the media was rushing to judge. Dutch watched from his window as his community literally stood between him and his critics, their loyalty earned through years of quiet neighborliness rather than viral moments. He understood that this was what he'd been trying to teach the teenagers. All along, that character was measured not by individual actions, but by how people responded when their principles were tested by hostile forces. The battle lines were drawn: federal orders versus local loyalty, institutional policy versus individual relationships, viral outrage versus witness transformation. The teenagers had learned about honor and sacrifice in theory, but now they would discover whether those lessons translated into courage when the whole world was watching, and most of it was disapproving. Evening news broadcasts would frame this as a story about juvenile justice and military overreach, but the real story was simpler and more profound. 3 young people learning that growing up meant defending the people who'd helped them become better than they'd been, even when that defense came at personal cost. Evening news broadcasts would frame this as a story about juvenile justice and military overreach, but the real story was simpler and more profound. 3 young people learning that growing up meant defending the people who'd helped them become better than they'd been, even when that defense came at personal cost. Saturday morning brought the inevitable escalation. Patricia Kellerman had spent Friday evening on 3 different cable news programs, each appearance amplifying her narrative that the mentorship program represented soft justice that dishonored veterans by treating their victimization as a teaching opportunity rather than a crime deserving punishment. The teenagers discovered the latest development when Marcus's phone exploded with notifications at 06:30 hours. Someone had leaked his juvenile record, minor infractions from middle school, a single detention for skipping class, academic probation from his sophomore year when his parents' work schedules had left him unsupervised too many evenings. Marcus, Chen, a pattern of disrespect, he read aloud from his phone as the 3 of them huddled in Tyler's grandmother's kitchen. "They're making me sound like a career criminal." Sophia's stomach clenched as she scrolled through her own character assassination. Her father's deployment records had somehow been obtained and misrepresented, suggesting that military families produced children who disrespected the very values their parents fought to defend. Tyler faced the cruelest treatment. Comments about his learning disabilities, suggestions that his cognitive differences made him naturally prone to destructive behavior, amateur psychology diagnosing him based on grainy video footage. "They're not attacking what we did," Tyler said, his processing differences allowing him to see patterns others missed. "They're attacking who we are. There's a difference." Dorothy Williams, who'd spent 40 years teaching teenagers from complicated backgrounds, recognized the strategy immediately. When people can't win arguments on facts, they attack character. It's the oldest trick in politics and the newest weapon in social media. The personal attacks had their intended effect: doubt, shame, the terrible question of whether their critics might be partially right. Had they been fooling themselves about their transformation? Were they really just privileged kids who'd avoided real consequences through connections and luck? Dutch found them in his garage that afternoon, sitting among his military memorabilia. Like refugees seeking sanctuary, his cognitive struggles had worsened under the stress of media attention, but his instructor instincts remained sharp enough to recognize young people in crisis. "You look like I felt after my first firefight in Korea," he said, settling into his workbench chair with careful movements, "like you're wondering if you're strong enough for the battles ahead." Marcus looked up from his phone, where fresh comments continued accumulating. "Maybe they're right, Mr. Kowalski. Maybe we don't deserve a second chance. Maybe we're just kids who got lucky." Lucky? Dutch's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd seen actual luck in combat zones. "Son, luck is when a Chinese mortar lands 10 feet away and doesn't explode. Luck is when your transport gets delayed and avoids an ambush. What happened here wasn't luck, it was choice. My choice to teach instead of condemn, your choice to learn instead of resist." Sophia wiped tears from her eyes, her artistic sensibility overwhelmed by the ugliness of public judgment. "But what if we can't handle this? What if we're not as strong as you think we are?" Dutch's response came from decades of training young people for impossible missions. Strength isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you build by choosing courage when fear would be easier. Every single time you choose right over easy, you get stronger. Tyler's emotional intelligence caught something the others missed. Dutch's increasing confusion about recent events, his struggle to maintain focus during their conversation. Their mentor was fighting his own battle against time and memory, making his guidance even more precious. "Mr. Kowalski," Tyler said gently, "what do you need us to do?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Dutch understood that his students were offering to become his protectors, to stand between him and critics who questioned his judgment and attacked his dignity. "I need you to remember what you've learned about honor," Dutch replied, his voice strengthening with purpose. "Honor isn't about being perfect. It's about owning your mistakes, learning from them, and using that learning to become better than you were." Outside, the media circus continued its relentless cycle of outrage and analysis. But inside Dutch's garage, 3 teenagers were discovering that character wasn't something you possessed. It was something you practiced, especially when the practice became painful. The real test of their transformation wouldn't come from completing community service or restoring a vandalized car. It would come from standing up for principles they'd learned when those principles became unpopular, defending a mentor whose cognitive struggles made him vulnerable to attack, and proving that second chances weren't gifts to be squandered, but opportunities to be earned through sustained commitment to becoming better people. Monday would bring new challenges as the story reached national attention, and political figures began using their situation as evidence for larger arguments about justice, military policy, and American values. But they would face those challenges together, armed with lessons about courage that couldn't be learned from textbooks or social media, only from walking through fire and discovering they could withstand the heat. Monday would bring new challenges as the story reached national attention, and political figures began using their situation as evidence for larger arguments about justice, military policy, and American values. But they would face those challenges together, armed with lessons about courage that couldn't be learned from textbooks or social media, only from walking through fire and discovering they could withstand the heat. The game changer arrived at 0800 Monday morning in the form of Command Sergeant Major Elena Rodriguez, Sophia's aunt, recently returned from her 4th deployment to Afghanistan. Elena had learned about the controversy through military channels and driven 18 hours straight from Fort Bragg to Clearwater, her dress uniform pressed and her expression carrying the kind of controlled fury that made seasoned soldiers step aside. She found Patricia Kellerman setting up for another live broadcast outside Dutch's house, the blogger's makeup artist applying final touches while a cameraman adjusted equipment angles. "Ms. Kellerman," Elena's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I understand you've been commenting on military families and veteran affairs." Kellerman looked up, recognizing opportunity in the form of an actual soldier willing to engage. "Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez, I presume. I've been covering the story about your niece and the other vandals who made a mistake and chose redemption over excuses," Elena interrupted. "I've read your blog posts. You've never served, never deployed, never faced the kind of choices that forge character in young people, but you're comfortable judging a Korean War veteran's wisdom and a military family's honor." The confrontation drew immediate media attention, cameras swiveling to capture the exchange between the career soldier and the civilian blogger who'd made her reputation criticizing military culture. "I'm defending veteran dignity," Kellerman replied, her practiced media composure faltering under Elena's steady gaze. "These children vandalized a war hero's property and received special treatment instead of justice." Justice? Elena's laugh carried the edge of someone who'd seen actual injustice in combat zones. Harold Kowalski chose to teach instead of punish. He turned vandals into protectors, destruction into restoration. That's not soft justice. That's the kind of leadership that wins wars and builds character. Inside Dutch's house, the teenagers watched the confrontation through the front window, their anxiety mixing with growing hope that they might not be fighting this battle alone. Elena's arrival had triggered a cascade of support they hadn't expected. By noon, Dutch's phone was ringing with calls from former students. Navy SEALs he'd trained decades earlier, now scattered across military installations worldwide, but united in loyalty to their old instructor. Master Chief David Park called. "From San Diego, Chief Kowalski, I saw the news coverage. You trained me in 1987, taught me that leadership meant making hard choices when easy ones were available. I've got 30 active duty SEALs who want to testify to your character and judgment." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell reached out. "From Norfolk. Sir, you taught me that strength without wisdom is just destruction waiting to happen. These kids are lucky to have learned that lesson from you, instead of learning it the hard way in life." The testimonials created a counter-narrative that began undermining the simple story of kids getting off easy. These weren't just character references, they were professional assessments from combat veterans who understood the difference between accountability and punishment, between justice and revenge. Dr. Emily Chen, meanwhile, was conducting her own campaign. Her medical colleagues at Tampa General had begun sharing stories about the teenager's transformation. Marcus's improved focus and academic performance, Sophia's channeling of artistic talents toward memorial projects, Tyler's growing confidence despite his learning challenges. "I've watched 3 young people discover purpose and direction through mentorship," she told Channel 8's evening news anchor. "That's not special treatment. That's effective intervention that prevents future problems instead of just punishing past mistakes." By Tuesday, the story had evolved beyond simple outrage into complex debate about restorative versus punitive justice. Veterans organizations began issuing statements supporting Dutch's approach, while education professionals pointed to research showing mentorship programs' effectiveness with at-risk youth. The teenagers found themselves in the surreal position of becoming advocates for their own transformation. Marcus appeared on a local morning show, articulating lessons about honor and responsibility with the confidence Dutch had helped him develop. Sophia created art installations depicting the difference between destruction and restoration, her work displayed in the high school's main hallway. Tyler wrote an essay about learning disabilities and second chances that was picked up by national education blogs. Dutch, despite his increasing cognitive struggles, became a symbol of veteran wisdom and the kind of leadership that transcended simple punishment. His garage filled with visitors, former students sharing stories, community members expressing support, teenagers from other schools seeking mentorship opportunities. Jake Morrison received new orders Tuesday afternoon, but these came from a different source. Rear Admiral Thomas Sullivan, himself a former Dutch Kowalski student, had been following the controversy through military channels. "Chief Morrison," the Admiral's aide explained, "Admiral Sullivan is authorizing extended community engagement as part of a pilot program for veteran military youth mentorship initiatives. Your team's work in Clearwater will serve as a model for similar programs nationwide." The political momentum was shifting, but the real victory was quieter and more personal. 3 teenagers who'd begun the month as vandals seeking social media attention had become young adults, willing to defend principles they'd learned, protect a mentor who'd shown them mercy, and stand up for values that couldn't be measured in likes or views. The media circus would eventually move on to other stories, but the relationships forged in Dutch's garage, between mentor and students, between veterans and youth, between neighbors who'd learned to look beyond surface judgments, would endure long after the cameras stopped rolling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.